76 acres. That's all it is. Not a city, not a neighborhood, not even a full district. Just a small piece of land floating in the East River, surrounded by water, guarded by steel, and soaked in more violence than some war zones. For decades, Rikers Island has been called many names: the land of broken justice, the forgotten island, the place New York tries not to think about. But there's one title people rarely say out loud: a living map of violence. Because inside those 76 acres, every corner has a story. Every hallway has a secret. Every building has a reputation built on the blood, fear, and desperation of the people trapped inside it. Tonight, we are not just looking at Rikers as a jail. We're exploring it like geography, like a hostile landscape where danger shifts, spreads, and erupts depending on where you stand. A place where one wrong step, one wrong turn, one wrong unit can mark the difference between survival and a story cut short. This is the story of a place so chaotic, even the people who work there can't fully map it. Where violence doesn't just happen, it migrates, it evolves, and it flows through the compound like a living organism. And for the men trapped inside, understanding this geography is the only way to stay alive. Because Rikers isn't just a jail. It's a maze, a pressure cooker, a battlefield carved into concrete. And tonight, you're about to walk through it, unit by unit, block by block, fight by fight. Through smuggling routes that officers pretend not to see, through dorms where the lights never go off, through cells where enemies sleep just 3 feet apart, and through corridors where even officers walk with their backs to the wall. This is the geography of fear. This is the architecture of chaos. This is Rikers Island, like you've never seen it before. Welcome to 76 acres of fear. If you look at Rikers Island from above, from the cold, distant view of a drone or a passing airplane, it doesn't look like a jail at all. It looks like a mistake. A slab of uneven land stitched together by decades of rushed construction, a handful of mismatched buildings, roads that twist and double back on themselves, and a shoreline surrounded by rusted fences and swirling grey water. What most people don't know is this: Rikers Island wasn't supposed to exist as a jail. Not at this scale. Not with this purpose. Not holding this much pain. The island began as a literal dumping ground, a marshy plot where New York City pushed its waste, its ash, its unwanted debris. Then someone had an idea: what if we build a jail out here? Far enough from the city that no one has to think about it, but close enough that it still counts. And just like that, the blueprint for a future disaster was born. By the 1990s, Rikers wasn't one jail. It was a cluster of 10 massive facilities, each with its own culture, its own power dynamics, its own rhythm of violence. The closer you look, the worse it becomes. The buildings don't align. The units don't communicate. The island wasn't designed for safety. It was designed to be out of sight, out of mind. Inside, the geography is a psychological weapon. Long corridors with blind spots. Stairwells where screams echo but cameras don't reach. Recreation yards cut off from direct supervision. Dormitories crammed so tightly that fights erupt before officers even arrive. And then, the most dangerous truth of all: no single person knows the entire layout. Not the inmates. Not the new officers. Not even some of the veterans. Because Rikers shifts. Units get closed, repurposed, reopened. Old wings are patched with new structures. Hallways are rerouted. Blocks built for 50 people now hold 90. Gangs carve territories within territories. Unofficial borders drawn in fear. If you ask 10 inmates to draw a map of Rikers, you'll get 10 different maps. None of them will be wrong, but none of them will be fully right either. And that's the first layer of the violence: confusion. The kind of confusion that keeps men paranoid, always looking over their shoulder, always watching the door, always memorizing escape paths even when there's nowhere to run. Every corner of the island is a pressure point. Every building is a battleground. Every unit has its own history. A history written in fists, razors, and makeshift weapons carved from toothbrushes, pens, and bed frames. Tonight, we are stepping into that world. But not from the outside looking in. We're re-walking through it with the people who live and breathe it, the ones who memorize the danger like scripture. You're about to see Rikers as its residents see it. Not a jail, but a shifting map of survival, fear, strategy, dominance, and betrayal. Because on this island, geography isn't just land. It's life or death. If Rikers Island is a world of violence, then C-74 is at heartbeat. For decades, this building, officially known as the Robert N. Devereaux Complex, was the home of the youngest inmates on the island. Teenagers. Boys who should have been in school, not survival training. Most of them didn't know how the court system worked. Few had ever been inside a jail before. And yet, C-74 didn't treat them like kids. It treated them like soldiers in a war they never asked to fight. Walk through its front gates, and the first thing you notice isn't the noise, though the noise is constant. It's the heat. Thick, stale heat that rises from the concrete floors and mixes with the smell of sweat, disinfectant, and fear. The ceilings always feel too low. The corridors too narrow. The lights too dim, flickering overhead like half-dead fireflies. This isn't a building made for rehabilitation. It's a furnace. And for the boys trapped inside, C-74 becomes a crash course in violence, not because they want it, but because the geography demands it. Inside these walls, power shifts every day. Every dormitory has its own rules. Who controls the phones, who manages the food trays, who decides whether you can walk to the bathroom without someone following you. And if you don't learn fast, you don't last long. But there is something even more dangerous than the fights: the layout. The housing units in C-74 are shaped in a way that makes chaos feel unavoidable. Wide open spaces with dozens of people in one massive room, few barriers, few hiding places, and nowhere for officers to position themselves without being outnumbered. Imagine trying to sleep knowing the person who wants to hurt you is 10 feet away. Imagine trying to eat while your back is exposed. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to a scream, and knowing the officers might not reach the scene in time. This is the geography of C-74, a world where fear travels faster than footsteps. In some units, inmates develop an instinct, a sixth sense that tells them when something is about to happen. A sudden quiet, a shift in the energy, a look exchanged across the room. Violence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It radiates, growing from a corner of the dorm, spreading through whispers, and exploding in the space of a heartbeat. Some boys learn the rhythm of this place. Others drown in it. And yet, for all its danger, C-74 isn't the worst building on the island. Not by a long shot. Because deeper within Rikers lies a place where violence ain't just a threat, it's a tradition, a culture, a language, a place where geography doesn't just reflect fear, it creates it. If C-74 was the fire that shaped the youngest inmates, C-95 was the engine that kept Rikers running. The Otis Bantam Correctional Center, known simply as C-95, was the beating, grinding, relentless core of the island. Everyone passed through here. Short-stay detainees, long-term cases, gang members, first-timers, people waiting for trial, for transfers, for a future that had already forgotten them. To most New Yorkers, Rikers Island is just one place. But for the people who lived inside it, C-95 was the mainland, a chaotic crossroads where thousands of bodies and stories collided every single year. The first thing you notice inside C-95 isn't the violence. It's the movement. Every hour, hundreds of detainees flow through its corridors, to court, to medical, to new housing units, to intake rooms where the walls sweat humidity and the benches are so overcrowded that men stand for hours on end. Imagine an airport terminal. Now imagine that airport with no order, no space, no mercy, just noise, frustration, and tension so thick it feels like another layer of skin. That was C-95. But what made this building truly dangerous wasn't just the number of people. It was the architecture. C-95 was designed around long, looping corridors, endless hallways where sound echoed but sightlines died at every turn. Blind spots hid everything. Corners swallowed screams. The sheer length of the building meant officers sometimes arrived minutes after the violence was already over. These corridors were battlefields disguised as walkways. Every step was a negotiation. Past rival crews, past unpaid debts, past grudges older than the inmates themselves. One hallway, a stretch of tiled floor between two housing units, was infamous. Inmates called it the Gauntlet. For years, there were no cameras here, no fixed officers. Just dozens of men funneling through a narrow passageway, shoulder to shoulder, with nowhere to run and no witnesses who wanted to be involved. It wasn't just a place people feared. It was a place people avoided remembering. The geography of C-95 created a truth everyone learned quickly. The most violent places are not always the loudest. Sometimes, they're the quietest. The stretches of hallway where nothing looks wrong, until everything goes wrong. But the danger didn't stop in the halls. The dormitories added another layer. Unlike cell blocks in other buildings, C-95's dorms were cavernous rooms with 50 beds arranged in tight, military rows. No privacy, no separation, no safe corner to hide in. If C-74 was a furnace, C-95 was a pressure cooker. Disputes travelled freely. Retaliation travelled faster. And because this was the island's major intake centre, alliances dissolved and reformed daily. Nobody knew who was walking in next. Nobody knew who was getting released tomorrow. Nobody had time to build stable hierarchies. The result was organised chaos, a violent ecosystem that reinvented itself every single week. Still, for all its danger, the real heart of Rikers violence was yet to come. Because buried deeper on the island, beyond the intake centres, beyond the adolescents, beyond the chaos of movement, stood a building with a reputation so dark that even officers whispered its name with caution. A place where geography didn't just shape violence, it magnified it. Where every step inside felt like stepping into a story that thousands of men had lived and would never forget. And that place was called AMKC. The Anna M. Cross Centre, known island-wide as AMKC, wasn't just another building on Rikers. It was the island's gravity well. A place where tensions pooled, violence intensified, and fear became something physical, something you could almost taste in the air the moment you stepped inside. To officers, AMKC was a headache. To administrators, it was a liability. But to the inmates, AMKC was a legend. The building where nothing stayed peaceful for long. On paper, AMKC was designed to be efficient. Multiple housing units stretched across long hallways, modern medical wings, specialized mental health areas, and enough space to process thousands of men. But blueprints don't survive contact with reality. And the reality of AMKC was this: every part of the building was alive with conflict. Conflicts that lived in its walls, slept in its corners, and woke up with every new sunrise. The layout of AMKC played a cruel trick on everyone inside. The housing units were built like islands, circular nodes connected by long, narrow passageways that resembled the arteries of a massive concrete organism. Once you were inside a unit, there were only two ways out: through a single door or on a stretcher. The dorms were wide open, just like in C-95, but denser, louder, and hotter, packed with men who didn't know each other, didn't trust each other, and didn't have the luxury of time to figure things out. This wasn't a place where you built alliances slowly. This was a place where you made a friend or an enemy before lunch. And every dorm had a secret. Some were run by gangs, blood ties, street affiliations, neighborhood loyalties. Others were controlled by individuals, men who didn't need a crew because they had a reputation, cooperation from officers, or simply nothing left to lose. But the most feared dorms in AMKC were known collectively as the barns. These were older, larger units with an echo that carried every footstep and every whisper. They were built for visibility, but their sheer size made control impossible. In the barns, a man could get hurt on one side of the room, and someone on the opposite side wouldn't even notice until the shouting stopped. Every barn had its own culture: who controlled the tables, who controlled the TV, who called the shots on the phones, and who mediated disputes before they exploded. But AMKC's most powerful force wasn't the gangs or the leaders. It was the rumor mill. Rumors here traveled faster than officers, faster than the metal detectors, faster than the intercom system. A rumor could build tension, shift alliances, start fights, or end them. It was common knowledge. You never ignored a rumor in AMKC. You investigated it before it investigated you. And then, there was the unit known simply as 3 Main. 3 Main wasn't the most violent dorm. It wasn't the loudest, the dirtiest, or the most overcrowded. But it had a reputation, a place where nothing stayed hidden. Every grudge came out eventually. Every secret got exposed. Every man's real character was dragged to the surface. 3 Main was where the island tested you, not physically, but psychologically. If you were weak, the unit found a way to break you. If you were strong, it gave you more enemies. If you were clever, you survived. But barely. AMKC was a laboratory of violence, the perfect mixture of unstable ingredients packed into a single building surrounded by water. No matter how many times officers tried to clamp down, the tension always found a new pressure point. But for all its darkness, AMKC was still not the final circle of Rikers. Because further into the island, beyond the intake, beyond the medical wings, beyond the adolescent units, stood a facility with a geography so unforgiving that it changed the psychology of every man who entered it. A building where doors didn't just lock, they sealed. Where light didn't just dim, it disappeared. where sound didn't just echo, it suffocated. This was Rikers' most feared landscape, the jail within the jail. It was called GRVC. If the Anna M. Cross Center, or AMKC, was the gravity well of violence at Rikers Island, then the George R. Viano Center, GRVC, was the place where that gravity collapsed into something denser, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. GRVC wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't built like the sprawling dormitories of other units. No, GRVC was cold, silent, structured, and terrifying in a way that only highly controlled environments can be. This building was supposed to be the solution to Rikers' chaos, a place where inmates could be separated, monitored, and contained. A place where violence could be isolated and punished. Instead, GRVC became the cage inside the cage. A psychological pressure chamber where the environment itself turned inward, suffocating, crushing, pressing down on the mind until even the air you breathed felt predatory. Every corridor in GRVC looked exactly the same. Long, narrow, perfectly straight. A maze without curves. A hallway without mercy. You couldn't hide here. You couldn't blend into a crowd. You couldn't pretend you were invisible. The walls were too white. The lights were too bright. The silence was too loud. It was the kind of deafening silence that made you hear your own heartbeat, the kind that made every footstep behind you feel like an immediate threat. It was a silence that made grown men whisper their conversations like secrets being smuggled through a war zone. But what truly defined GRVC, what made it feared island-wide, was the classification of the inmates housed here. This wasn't a building for random detainees. This was where Rikers kept the men who couldn't be handled anywhere else. Not just violent offenders, but organized offenders, crew members, enforcers, leaders, shot callers, high-risk detainees who didn't need to raise their voices to cause trouble. GRVC was a chessboard of dangerous men. Men who understood power not as a weapon, but as a currency. The housing units here were smaller. The cells were tighter. Movement was severely restricted. Every single step you took was monitored. But that didn't stop violence. It just changed its shape. In GRVC, fights didn't erupt suddenly out of nowhere. They were planned, calculated, strategic. A man could be targeted on Monday, warned on Tuesday, isolated on Wednesday, and then attacked on Thursday, all without a single shout or threat being heard by the staff. This was the geography of slow violence, the kind that stalked you through the building's very architecture. One hallway, one meal slot, one shower rotation at a time. And then there were the isolated tiers, long rows of sealed doors where inmates were kept in near total solitude. Some men actually thrived here, using the quiet to build their focus, their strength, their resolve. But many others simply unraveled. GRVC was more than just a building. It was a test of the human mind. A test most men didn't ask for and weren't prepared to take. But even GRVC had its limits. Even GRVC had inmates it couldn't control. Even GRVC had stories that officers whispered about in the locker rooms with the doors closed and the radios turned off. And for those men, the ones too unpredictable for AMKC, too violent for other units, too explosive even for GRVC, Rikers had one final destination. A building where hope didn't enter, where futures didn't matter, where the geography wasn't just dangerous, it was hopeless. A place many inmates called the cemetery. Its official name? The Bing. And next, we step into the darkest corner of the island. There are places on Rikers Island that break the body. There are places that break the mind. But the Bing, officially known as the Central Punitive Segregation Unit, was the place that broke time itself. To the outside world, the Bing was simple. A disciplinary unit. A segregation wing. A punishment block for inmates who'd crossed a line. But for the men who lived there, the ones who stared at those walls day after day, they had another word for it, the cemetery. Because when you entered the Bing, you didn't just lose your freedom. You lost your sense of days, your sense of direction, and sometimes, the very person you were before that door slammed shut behind you. Every hallway in the Bing was straight, empty, and silent. Cells lined up like sealed coffins. There were no open dorms, no chaotic day rooms. Just steel doors with tiny windows and a slot that opened only when officers felt like acknowledging you existed. In most buildings on the island, you could feel the world around you. The noise, the movement, the raw electricity of thousands of people living on top of one another. But in the Bing, all of that vanished. The silence was thick, heavy, unnatural. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the echo of footsteps, officers checking cells, or inmates pacing endlessly in 4, maybe 6 steps, forward and backward, trying to remind themselves they still had a body they could control. Some men counted their steps out loud just to keep their sanity intact. Others talked to the walls. Others talked to no one at all. But the real violence of the Bing wasn't the fights, because fights were rare here. Not impossible, but rare. No, the violence lived in the invisibility. In the Bing, the geography stripped you of your audience. Your enemies couldn't see you. Your allies couldn't see you. Even the officers saw you only when it was absolutely required. Men who were legends in GRVC became ghosts here. Men who commanded dorms in AMKC became whispers. Men who were terrors in the intake units became mere shadows behind steel and concrete. If Rikers Island was a world, the Bing was its void. And inside that void, time didn't behave normally. Days blended together. Nights stretched into eternity. Minutes could move with agonizing slowness, and then disappear without warning. A week could feel like a year, and a year could feel like nothing at all. It was common for men to lose track completely. Their release dates, their court appearances, their memories, their entire sense of self. Some inmates claimed they could hear the island breathing outside their walls, the violence, the chaos, the rhythm of survival, but they couldn't reach it. They couldn't participate in it. They couldn't defend themselves from rumors, debts, or enemies circulating just outside their door. And that was the most dangerous part. The rest of Rikers kept moving. But inside the Bing, you didn't. By the time that door finally reopened, everything could be different. Your allies could be gone. Your enemies could be stronger. The entire hierarchy of your old dorm could have shifted. A single rumor, left to fester while you were gone, could completely ruin you. You walked out of the void and back into a world that had moved on without you. From the organized chaos of GRVC to the soul-crushing silence of the Bing, every building on Rikers Island was designed not just to contain bodies, but to control minds. The architecture wasn't just concrete and steel, it was a weapon. Did you know a single lie could follow you forever? Or that one simple misunderstanding could get you marked for retaliation? On Rikers Island, the world doesn't stop for you. It evolves, it shifts, it forgets you. For many men locked in solitary confinement, what they call the Bing, it wasn't just punishment. It was like attending their own funeral while still alive. But Rikers Island had another landscape, an environment where violence wasn't just present. It thrived in ways that even corrections officers were afraid to confront. It was a land of pure chaos, a land of deafening noise, a place with no clear borders or predictable rules. The detainees had a name for it, the jungle. Its official name was RNDC. If the Bing was a silent, suffocating void, frozen in time, then RNDC, the Robert N. Devoren Center, was its polar opposite. RNDC was chaos itself. A world built on constant noise, movement, adrenaline, and total unpredictability. It was a place where the walls practically vibrated with tension, every single hour of the day. The inmates called it the jungle. And it wasn't just because of the violence, although there was plenty of that. It wasn't because of the oppressive heat, which in the summer felt like a punishment all on its own. And it wasn't even because of its size, though RNDC was a massive, sprawling maze of interconnected units, each one louder than the last. No, they called it the jungle because everyone there was unfinished. It was filled with teenagers, young adults, men who were barely out of childhood, caught in that strange space between being a kid and being a criminal. These were the ones who walked in with swagger and bravado, but hadn't yet learned that Rikers Island operates on its own laws, its own ecosystems, with its own predators and its own prey. RNDC wasn't a place where stories ended. It was where they began. It was where young men got their first real taste of the island's geography, its politics, and its invisible rules that dictated every fight, every alliance, and every betrayal. The moment you walk into any unit in RNDC, you hear it. The noise. It's not coming from one direction. It's coming from everywhere at once. Shouting, laughing, arguments over the phone, arguments over what's on TV, arguments over absolutely nothing. The hollow clang of metal tables being slammed, the thud of sneakers running across concrete floors. It's the steady, deep rumble of dozens of clashing personalities, all crammed into a space far too small to contain them. If Rikers Island had a heartbeat, it was thumping inside RNDC. And the physical layout, the geography, it amplified everything. These weren't quiet, individual cell blocks. These were pods, round, open bay units with high ceilings and long lines of sight. From almost any point, one man could see nearly everyone else, which, of course, meant that everyone else could see him, too. In RNDC, visibility itself was a form of violence. There was no hiding. There wasn't a single corner where you could let your guard down. There was no quiet strategy to just slip through a room unnoticed. If you walked through RNDC, you were seen. And you were instantly judged, measured, and categorized. Some inmates rose to the top quickly, the ones with the loud voices, the quick hands, the ones who showed no fear. Others managed to survive by staying quiet, aligning themselves with crews, carefully negotiating their own safety, and avoiding any unnecessary attention. But for many, RNDC was the first place they learned that survival wasn't just physical. It was political. The phones had handlers who controlled access. The showers had rotations you had to respect. Certain tables in the common area belonged to certain territories. Even the outdoor handball courts had hidden rules. Which borough's crew got the next game, which crew controlled the sidelines, which inmates were even allowed to challenge the winner. Nothing, not even recreation, was free. And then there were the stairwells. Stairwells that officers themselves dreaded. Stairwells with blind angles and poor lighting. Stairwells where the cameras only captured shadows. These were the places where a whispered threat could instantly become an ambush, and that ambush could be completely forgotten by the time the next shift came on duty. But for all its danger, for all its unpredictability, RNDC had one truth that set it apart from the rest of the island. Nobody stayed there forever. Everyone in RNDC was headed somewhere else. Some were on their way to court. Some were being transferred to AMKC or GRVC, other jails on the island. Some were going to the Bing. Some were lucky enough to be going home. And some were headed upstate, to prisons far worse than Rikers. RNDC wasn't a final destination. It was a transition point. It was a funnel where young men first stepped onto the island's map, and where that geography began to shape them. Some grew stronger. Some grew colder. Some broke. Some learned the rules too quickly. Others, not quickly enough. And inside this jungle, every single person eventually had the same realization. Rikers Island wasn't just a group of jails. It was its own world, a world built on just 76 acres, shaped by fear, and ruled by its own unique geography. But that geography didn't end with the buildings. The Real story lived in the roads between them, the escort routes, the crowded waiting pens, the hidden paths where danger flowed like underground rivers. And next, we are going to walk those roads. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. 76 acres. A tiny piece of land floating in the East River. But within it, an entire world exists, one governed by fear, strategy, and survival. This is Rikers Island. And it's not just a collection of jails. It's not just concrete and steel, or a maze of cells, dorms, and hallways. It's a living, breathing map of violence. Every single unit, every corridor, every blind corner teaches a lesson. Some men fight. Some men hide. Some men adapt. And some men are simply broken by the system. The very geography of Rikers shapes its inmates far more than the law ever could. It's this landscape that determines who survives, who rises in the hierarchy, who falls, and who disappears from the stories entirely. But there is a haunting truth in all of this. Rikers doesn't just confine bodies. It confines minds, it confines potential, and most tragically, it confines hope. For the people who work there, the officers, administrators, and social workers, the challenge is endless. And for those who live there, the inmates, the stakes are even higher. Every step you take, every corner you turn, every single glance matters. The violence here isn't random. It's geographical. It's psychological. And in this environment, it can feel inevitable. And yet, amid the fear, the chaos, and the bloodlines drawn on this island, there are moments of resilience. You see these brief, powerful flashes of humanity that remind you that even here, in the very heart of controlled chaos, people survive. People endure. And sometimes, people even change. Rikers Island is so much more than a jail. It's a mirror, a stark reflection of society's failures, a detailed map of consequence, and a terrifying geography of fear. 76 acres hold infinite stories. It's a world most people will thankfully never see, but it's also a world that leaves an indelible mark on everyone who walks its concrete corridors. So as you leave this island in your mind tonight, remember this. The geography of violence isn't confined to this one place. It exists wherever fear, power, and survival collide. Rikers Island is merely the most extreme, the most concentrated map of it. This is 76 acres of fear. And now, you know the landscape. Thanks for watching.